Welcome to the Air Force Doctrine podcast. On this episode of the podcast, the LeMay Center presents LEDx Doctrine, Operation ANACON on Tap. This event was a roundtable doctrine discussion hosted by the LeMay Center and the Air University Innovation Accelerator. Operation ANACON on Tap featured a panel of 6 A-10 pilots who planned and executed close air support operations in support of U.S. Army soldiers in Afghanistan in the early stages of Operation Enduring Freedom. They discuss uncertainty in combat operations, command and control of air-to-ground missions, mission command, and operations that disperse in austere locations. Please join us.
Welcome on behalf of the LeMay Center, Air University, and AUIX. This is a LEDx Doctrine. So what we decided to do in the effort to make doctrine a cool word again is to start bringing in some of our heroes that have done fantastic things. They've expanded our doctrine. You hear El Cid and some of the other guys talk about how the Operation Anaconda actually changed the way in which we operate. It built a lot of what the A-10 community grew into, came out of this operation. So it affected both tactical and operational level doctrine. So we thought we'd bring these guys in and have them tell their war stories. And the reason this is so important is Anaconda, if we're going to cage it any other way, was almost pure chaos from the top looking down. And so they worked through this chaos. They worked through this uncertainty. They worked through bear bases. They worked through situations that had never been done before. And there's a lot of parallels to what they did 2 decades ago and what we need to do now into the future for ACE. And so we thought we'd bring them together, have them tell some war stories and pull some lessons learned, some future advice for our airmen out of their stories. What I'd like to do is get started and just have each one of them kind of tell you a little bit of where they were at that particular point in time and their contribution to Anaconda, and then we'll get right into some background and we'll get right into the war stories.
Bob Silva, go by Mumbles. I was the ADO, Assistant Deputy for Operations, in the 74th Fighter Squadron out of Pope Air Force Base. And I was put in charge of the Advon team, both to go to when we deployed to Al Jaber, but more importantly, when we went to Jacobabad and also to Bagram. And as well as being a pilot, I flew in the missions mostly out of Bagram.
I'm K9 Kostelnik. My God-given name's Eddie, but I don't go by that. I was 23rd OSS OS2W, only deployed over there. I was a strap-hanging lieutenant colonel. I don't know how I got involved in this thing. I was invited to go along for a deployment, and I said, heck yeah. Got over there, pretty much didn't have a job except for helping the ADOs be an ADO, and so I just flew. It was kind of nice. It was a great opportunity, and I wasn't going to say no. So.
That's right.
Matt Newenswander, go by El Cid. I was the deputy commander of the 332nd Air Expeditionary Group. By the way, those are red tails with a lineage back to the Tuskegee Airmen. So I had been in theater since July, so I got the opportunity to go through 911. And so the 332nd at the time was flying sorties over Iraq and flying sorties over Afghanistan with F-16s and F-15Es, and we've been doing that since about October. And then when Operation Anaconda happened and things did not go well for the conventional ground forces, a decision was made to take the A-10s forward, and I was the detachment commander of both the movement to Pakistan and then later to Afghanistan.
Hi, I'm Andrea Kneep. I go by Pop-Tart. I was a flight commander in the 74th Fighter Squadron at Pope Air Force Base and went forward with the 74th Fighter Squadron when we deployed to Kuwait. I was a flight commander there also, and then went into Afghanistan when we went into Anaconda, landed at Jacobabad, and then I was also in the advance party to Bagram when we went into Bagram and moved into there.
Martin Dahl, call sign surgeon. I had taken command of the squadron about the year prior, so I've been in command for 1 year. We deployed in the very end of February. Within the first week, we got scrambled down to Pakistan, and the story begins there. I was in the 74th in Desert Storm as guest help. I was the 75th guy back then. And I flew the 74th in Kosovo. They joined us, and I was with the 81st out of Spangdahlem. So as a squadron commander, 1 year in, already 3,000 hours in the jet. In my third rodeo, I was very blessed to have that background to really point in the right direction, right vector, a bunch of great folks, maintenance especially, and a few pilots to go take this on. More later.
Soup Campbell. I was the Chief of Weapons and Tactics for the squadron going forward, and I led the first sortie into Afghanistan.
Perhaps if you go ahead, what we'd like to do is we'll give you a brief overview of the operation and some of the nuances to it, then we'll throw it back to the panel to fill in the blanks. What we want to do here is give them an opportunity to tell some of the more unique stories instead of just telling the whole story of Anaconda. So we'll give you a little background, and then we'll let them get into the more micro stuff.
The 74th Fighter Squadron is near and dear to my heart, so here's to the world-famous Flying Tigers of the 74th Thunder. Like every good history starts, there they were, September 11th, 2001. Following the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, U.S. forces began Operation Enduring Freedom with the intent of disrupting Al-Qaeda's ability to function as an organization and to disrupt the Taliban. So this operation mostly starts as a CIA and SOF-led effort initially. They formed a partnership with the Northern Alliance, who was able to capture the capital city of Kabul and in mid-November 2001, and there were other operations to further disrupt the Taliban and catch Osama bin Laden, such as the Battle of Tora Bora. Most of the U.S. Air Force support to this operation initially was B-1s, B-2s, B-52s, F-16s, Strike Eagles, and then F-18s and F-14s off of aircraft carriers in the Indian Ocean. As the operation continues and moves into the spring of 2002, intelligence reports that there's a large concentration of Al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters located in the Shai-Kot Valley, which is marked right here on this map of Afghanistan by Objective Remington, which is between Gardez and Kos, the symbols there on the map. So the intelligence says there's only between 100 to 274 inexperienced Taliban fighters that are on the valley floor, and that if we attack them, they will try to escape into Pakistan. So at this point, the U.S. Army elected to conduct an Operation Anaconda, with the objective of mopping up the Al-Qaeda and Taliban forces in the valley. And their intent was to conduct an air assault using 101st Airborne Division and some units from the 10th Mountain Division to block the mountain passes and the east side of that valley to prevent them from moving into Pakistan while some Afghan national forces moved into the valley to actually destroy them. So here you can see a picture of the Shai-Kot Valley. You're looking at this from the kind of the northwest, looking southeast. This valley is not very big. It's only 9 kilometers by 5 kilometers. You can see the mountains on the east side are peaks from 10 to 14,000 feet. So we're talking about a battle that's happening in an area that looks like the Rocky Mountains of the western United States. There's also this giant feature on the east side here that they call the Whale. And then the valley itself, of this village of Sirhunkel, is in the middle, and that is where the intelligence indicated that the bulk of those forces were supposed to be. So the plan was for the U.S. Army to block the passes and have a few task forces of SOF teams to assist with blocking the escape routes out of the valley, while the Afghan national forces moved into Objective Remington and mopped them up. U.S. Army conventional units that were involved in this. This is the first time that we've used U.S. Army conventional units in Afghanistan other than just for like air-based defense. So the units of the 101st Airborne and 10th Mountain Division that were there did not bring their aligned Air Support Operations Squadron and ASOC and TACP personnel with them into the theater. There's a lot of reasons behind why they did not bring them in there, but the C2 structure for conducting air-to-ground operations was not in place for this event. They did not bring very much of their organic fire support. Normally the Army would use artillery for their own fire support, and since it was an air assault type mission, they did not bring very much of that equipment either. And so most of their fire support was supposed to come from U.S. Army Apache helicopters. All right, C2 and ISR was provided by AWACS, JSARs, P3s, and RPAs. The CAOC at Al Udeid and the Air Force elements in this theater were not informed of this operation until about 4 days before it was actually set to take place. So there's a rush to plan, there's a rush to do all the coordination necessary to provide air support and to meet what the Army was requesting for the Air Force to do. And most of that support, again, was coming from F-16s and F-15s because the drive time from Al Jaber and Al Udeid and Al Dhafra in the Middle East to Afghanistan is 3 to 3.5 hours for the fast jets. This was considered prohibitive for A-10s at the time. A-10s were not involved because the drive is a full 5 hours for hogs. But for all the fast movers, got to go around Iran to get into the Operation Anaconda area. So it takes a little while to get there. At this point, the 74th Fighter Squadron was at Al Jaber in Kuwait. They were there for an Operation Southern Watch mission. They were configured to do CSAR alert and as an anti-armor mission, make sure Saddam Hussein stays on his side of the line at this point in time. So, and you can see the drive time here. This, with the United States overlaid, imagine taking off from Cannon Air Force Base, New Mexico, and doing a combat sortie in West Virginia, but you got to go through Pensacola, Florida first to get there. Okay, so it's a long way. So the operation begins. Army forces find significantly more Al-Qaeda in the valley than were anticipated, and they were well trained and dug in. So instead of only 100 to 200 forces, now we're in the 800 to 1,000, and they're up in the mountain passes already, and they're already pre-positioned. They're dug in and they're fighting back. Fire support from the Army Apaches. It goes well initially until all those Apaches take a lot of battle damage and get shot up. And then 5 out of those 7 Apaches are not able to rejoin the fight because they've taken too much damage. The Army starts to ask for more close air support and more fire support. And now it's time to bring in the hogs. First A-10 sorties for Operation Anaconda were flown by Sub and K9. They took off on those first sorties with very, very minimal mission planning ahead of time, with whatever data that the KOC could provide for them, and with no real recovery base. Taking off, go fly combat sortie here. We'll figure out where you're going to land once you get there. That landing location turned out to be Jacobabad, Pakistan. We'll get to that in a minute. But their operations on that first sortie consisted of trying to just figure out what was going on in the battle space, build their situational awareness, keep airplanes from running into each other, and keep us from committing a fratricide event against the Army forces that were on the ground in the valley. So they had a mess that they had to untangle, and they spent a lot of their first night just trying to find the right people on the radio, deconflict airplanes, and then get bombs on the ground, which they were successful in doing. After a 12-hour sortie with 7 air refuelings, they recovered at Jacobabad, Pakistan, which was then resupplied by El Cid, and I believe Mumbles was in that flight as well, from Al Jaber on AC-130s that they had taken off of the CSAR alert, and now we're starting to build up the base at Jacobabad. We've started to fly more sorties from Jacobabad. Pop-Tart arrives with a second 2 ships, and now we have 4 A-10s on the ground at Jacobabad, which they're trying to be real discreet about their operations. They're only supposed to fly at night. Well, that didn't work out so well, but I'll let them talk about that. But it took 7 AC-130 flights to finally get all up, but they were successful in conducting flight operations out of there for 7 days before they returned to Al Jaber. 2 weeks later, the 74th Fighter Squadron would return to Afghanistan, this time to Bagram. Mumbles would go forward, and then El Cid, Stoop, and Pop-Tart would be an advent team to Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, where they would begin to set that field up, and it was a very austere location. So that's this picture right here. So this is operations tent, mess hall, some of the sleeping quarters. This is what Bagram was like upon arrival. This is where they operated from. No running water.
Shortly after arrival.
Shortly after?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we built that.
Yeah, we built that. Yeah.
The runway's in poor condition. Unexploded ordnance excluded the areas. No running water. And we're working out of tents. But on 23 March, Lieutenant Colonel Dahl, Commander 74 at the time, led the first 6 ship into Bagram, which began 19 years of fighter operations from Bagram Air Base. The initial challenges faced by the 74th are similar to the challenges that airmen are going to face today in austere and dispersed environments, and we have a lot to learn from the men and women of the 74th. Here's to you. Thank you for paving the way for us in the hog community, and Thunder.
So it sounds like everything pretty well just fell in place, right? Easy to say, hard to do. I think one of the things is we researched Anaconda that just kept standing out over and over again is the cloud of uncertainty that is you guys are constantly under. You're just constantly uncomfortable, new problems, new solutions, working through that. So just to kind of kick this off, what are kind of your biggest moments of uncertainty, some of the big uncertainty moments? What were your solutions? How did you work through that?
I guess I'll start. So I was listening to the radio on the morning of March 2nd, which was a Saturday morning, and I had never heard grown men scream on the radio. So the 74th had just got there, and we're going, this is not going well. So what we did was we put the Strike Eagles, I called the OC, and we put the Strike Eagles, we canceled everything was flying into Iraq, and we sent them, told them to take sleeping pills and go back to bed. because we thought if we could at least get more air down there, and the LIMPAC actually was tankers. We didn't have enough tankers. I could have provided more fighters, but we didn't have the tankers. So we did send additional aircraft down there that Saturday night and Sunday morning from Al Jaber, but it still was not going well. And the thing that really broke the back was the Army basically said, we'll be okay with two ships of CAS 24/7, provided our Apaches provide the support. And the Apaches got all shot up. I mean, had it not been for the Apaches getting all shot up, we would have not got the all expense paid trip to both Jacobabad and then later to Bagram, because they were hovering in an area where that was bad for them. So the next day, the A-10 guys were listening, but it was mostly a Strike Eagle Viper day, and I pulled about a 16-hour day that day and went back about 8 or 9 at night, I think, and they called me in and they said, you're taking the A-10s forward. And I said, where? And they go, that's for you to figure out. So one of the things that we discussed previously is sometimes bosses know what they want, but they don't know what they need. They need people to tell them what the solutions are, because, General Mosley didn't have time to figure all that out. So bottom line, I called the leadership and some of the pilots over and said, okay, I need Arden, I need A, B, and C, and everyone else go back to bed. Go to bed, which was very hard for them all to do, because now, the uncertainty is who's going, how many tankers, how many airplanes. We thought we were taking 6 airplanes. It turned out that we couldn't have 6. We could only have 5 for diplomatic reasons. So that was uncertainty. And then we didn't know where we were going. So we planned to 5 places, all of which were bad ideas except for Jacobabad. But it was all based on the State Department, diplomatic clearance, and all that stuff. So that was the first big uncertainty thing. And so when I briefed Soup and the guys the next morning, I said, this is what we told, because I knew Jacobabad was the only option really effective. But one of the options was to fly all the way back home or to go into sea, because nobody wanted A-10s with shark's teeth with bombs on board. We would say, well, they're on a humanitarian mission, and everyone says, yeah, we don't think so. Okay, that doesn't look like a humanitarian aircraft. It looks like a shark smoking a cigar. So that was the first uncertainty, and I'll stop there. But at the operational level, that's what we did. We planned all night. We provided packets. Meanwhile, we're begging for Jacobabad because that was really the only option. And we had soft forces there at the same time. But it was a diplomatic clearance thing. And for those of you who may be in school, I'll tell you, make sure you get to know your international partners, because the reason we got in there is because General Musharraf and the president at the time and General Mosley went to ICAF together. And so they were buds. And he said, okay, I'll do this, but you're going to have to leave. More on that later, as soon as the Army disengages from the Shah-e Khat. That's from the group commander level looking down. I'll let these guys talk about the uncertainty.
Yeah, so what I'll add on is the squadron commander level. First hint I had something was going on besides, hey, there's a lot of things happening on the radios, is F-15E pilot got back, used to fly A-10s. His name is Chris Jr. Short. His dad was a CFAC during the Kosovo campaign. He comes and hunts me down, doesn't even go debrief, says, Surgeon, there's a CAS war in Afghanistan right now, and they need you. What? I run over and tell our mission plane guys, start gathering stuff. Something's going on, can't tell you anything. And then I got pulled out of chapel about a half an hour later, saying, with all this guidance that he just expounded upon. So the next point of uncertainty is, fine, we're going to launch a couple of jets in the morning. We're going to launch a couple more jets as soon as we, thereafter, start getting your maintenance together. So what do we take? What are the mission orders? Where are we going? What's commander's intent? Up until the time I departed on the 5th with the first C-17 load with a lot of bombs and the rest of the maintenance guys to fill out our footprint at Jacobabad, the only thing I was given is, it's a mess, go bring order to the battlefield. That was all we got. But at the squadron commander level, there may have been more. Well, you can kind of guess what you probably need to do. War is chaotic. It's always a mess. Cockpits are messy. You're looking for a perfect solution, perfect plan, perfect roll in. You never roll in. And that's just the way combat goes. In Kosovo, we were told, go get the press off my back. That was a CFAX instruction in that one. As a storm, we had very, very refined and meticulous commander's intent and a pretty well thought out plan. So my experience, it was going from pretty good to worse every time. Why we're going, where we're going, what to take. The next thing is, what do you do when you get there? And from a squadron commander level and up to the group command, that's the thing we're going to wrestle with for the entire week plus that we're there. So who's in charge? Who's doing what on the ground? How many fights are there? We're going to learn all these things we didn't know until we got there. How do you work through that with both the maintenance guys and your flyers, your intel, all your ops folks? What are you going to find? We eventually figure out where are we going to land anyway, what's going to be there. We were well received. There were people there. It was a mud heap, but we were actually pretty well taken care of. Contrast that to later the ballroom, which was the Wild Wild West show back east, and it was a mess. Junk heap. Over.
At the pilot level, so Soup, you're sent to bed, and you're not actually given a whole lot of instruction other than you're going to be on this first sortie. So what's kind of going through your mind? This is not what you came out here to do, at least not in that theater. What's that feel like going to bed with that level of uncertainty, and how are you preparing yourself?
So I was in the gym, and I get pulled out, told to go to the mission planning cell, and El Cid, Face, who's the group commander, and my boss are all standing there. So worried about getting fired or getting some non-judicial punishment of some sort for something I don't know that I did. But they go, you're in pilot rest. You're going to Afghanistan tomorrow. I said, I have no idea. Yeah, I've been monitoring things. I'm the chief of weapons and tactics. So I've been monitoring the misreps, the mission reports, and I know what's going on. But we have been told your mission is Southern Watch, so combat search and rescue alert. So that's all we're focused on. And I'm kind of keeping a side eye to this. So I know how bad it's going. And so quickly, the wing weapons officer and I get together. We say, all right, the biggest thing is we got to change the weapons loadout. So we're carrying cluster bombs, anti-armor munitions, all this stuff. And I'm like, we're going against soft targets, to put it politely. And I said, I need airburst weapons. I need high explosive incendiary bullets. I need Willie Pete white phosphorus marking rockets. And I need illumination flares. And I'm like, dude, get me that and I'll be good. I'll go to bed now. And I went and told Canine, I go, dude, we're on the hook. I give this a 90% chance of being canceled tomorrow because that's the way this stuff goes. I'll try to sleep. There's no way I'm going to sleep. But anyway, we woke up in the morning, we went, and no idea what you guys are going to do and how you're going to do it. And so we threw a backpack over the ejection seat. There's not much room in the hog, with a couple of flight suits and a pair of underwear or two. And so that morning, we had 30 minutes, roughly, of a briefing where they said, here's how you get in and out of Afghanistan, for lack of a better term. Like, go down the Persian Gulf, turn left, and go through Pakistan. And here's your smart pack. And so the lesson for me as a young captain at the time was leadership. And so the lesson was, first, I have a commander who's an absolute warhorse. Like, he attracts combat. And he's a weapons officer, and like, in my mind, he would lead this sortie in there. But he realized, just like El Cid realized, their value is in the rear. And I had a recency. I'd been a weapons officer I graduated weapons school about a year plus before. And K9 was a weapons school graduate. And he said, our value is back here. You guys have the recency of experience. You go forward. You go do this. And I leveraged that as a wing commander years later when I realized, like, the brilliance of leading from the front doesn't mean being out front. It's not the army, like, follow me. It's actually putting your tactical experts, because you have the experience of things that I can't do as a captain. And so he sent us forward. And the interesting thing was this was just dumped on our lap, and it was like, okay, go do this. And then the other leadership lesson in this moment was, as El Cid will back me on this, is I walk into this briefing with K9 that morning, and we've spent all our time looking at Iraq and all the rules of engagement and whatnot, and Afghanistan is a whole different animal. There was no way we were going to adhere to the rules of engagement, like stay above 10,000 feet. In an A-10, AG above ground level, when the valley floor is at 8,000 feet, that's 18,000 feet in a 46,000 pound jet that generates 18,000 pounds of thrust. You don't need to be a physicist to know that doesn't work. I'm looking at this going, this is nothing but disaster for us. Like, we're going to fail. Colonel Nichols, our group commander, says to me, he goes, Soup, he goes, you go out, you employ smartly. He goes, you do what you do best. Your direction is to go fix this. This is interesting commander's intent, but I can work with that. Go fix this. Okay, yes, sir. And he goes, don't worry about the rules of engagement. He goes, go out and do what you do, employ smartly, employ tactically. I've got your back. He goes, I will cover you on any of it. Breaking the hard deck, breaking all these other things that were rules of engagement. You go do what you do to save those young people's lives. And he goes, don't worry about it. And when K9 and I sat down and talked about it, and I went, that's rules I can work with.
So K9, from your perspective here, you're going into something that's a very wide, kind of unique commander's intent. So the training leading up to this in the A-10 community, the Air Force at large, do you think it prepared you for this event? Is there some really unique elements of training that gave you this idea to be able to switch and go into this unknown?
Yeah, I would answer that by saying that I think the breadth of our training over an entire career was probably right on target. And Soup said this earlier today when we were at lunch. He said, we create doctrine to deviate from doctrine, and that's what we do. I remember when I was here at ACSC reading about the Germans, they had Ausfragstaktik, mission orders. If you look at the history about Americans fighting against Japanese pilots, they'd say the Japanese were really good stick and rudder guys, but they were not that hard to kill because they flew a certain way, because they were so disciplined in the way they flew their airplanes, they would never break the rules. Whereas if you try to shoot down an American and he's on somebody's on his tail, he'll do whatever it takes to survive. He'll break every rule that has ever been written. So we have this breadth in our training as officers. I think it's really good because I've been to weapons school, but so you get the rules, but you also get talked about all the contingencies and the places you're going to depart, and then go from there to get the job done. So I think we're all well armed as officers. I think American officers are really well armed at that, because when I commanded later on, somebody once told me, the challenges of commanding millennials. But millennials and then Zers behind them are in some ways even better at it than we are, because there's no instruction manuals anymore. They don't need a doctrine. They just give them a computer and say, here it is, figure it out. And they don't read anything. And if you tell them to read a doctrine manual, they don't read it. They go do something, they figure out, what do you want me to do? And they figure out how to do it well, and they get it done better than you ever could have come up with. So I think we were pretty well armed.
We got these guys en route, but you still have a significant problem back at Al Jabber. Where are they going to land? And so you're working through this. What does that kind of look like? How are you fighting there? And then how do you eventually pick out Jacobabad and get yourself there in order to receive him?
Months before, in October, when the Special Forces went into an area called Rhino in the vicinity of Kandahar, we thought the KIOC down at Prince Sultan was going to have us send A-10s in to support that fight. And so at the time, I had the Maryland Air National Guard A-10s there. And so we had done a tremendous amount of planning in order to figure out if we could make that work. So I saved all that stuff. So when they offered us 5 bases and then they said, we need you to have 2 hours of station time, I already knew the only place that I could go and have 2 hours station time was Jacobabad, because that was one of the options before. So I started pushing for Jacobabad at 11 o'clock that night when they finally told me, this is what you want. They initially said, well, they always said 6 A-10s, and then they changed their mind later, and that's a different story, because we had to send 1 2-shift home because we couldn't have 6 airplanes on the ground, and later we had to send another one in by itself. But I saved that planning, and Eisenhower once said, plans are nothing, but planning is everything, and so I saved it. So I already had a jump on that because I had chair flown it maybe to try to figure out how long it took there. And that was a huge advantage for us because I could start working with the personnel. Unfortunately, no one is in the embassy at 1 a.m. So all of these requests hit the wire as soon as people got up that morning. And about an hour after they took off, we got clearance to go into Jacobabad, but I don't think they told them until much later than that because they wanted them to escort ultimately the helicopters off Roberts Ridge. I mean, that was the huge thing that they were able to do and kill a bunch of mortars, save a bunch of guys' lives and on that first sortie. But we were doing that, and then the other aspect, because I had another weapons officer and a couple of lieutenants, was, hey, do the least amount of planning. You have your weapons books, you have all the stuff that you came over here with. Let's not try to invent anything new. Let's try to give them the information that's different as we can to the best of our ability. Because they had trained really hard for the Iraq mission, but this was the first time that the A-10s were going to go into Afghanistan. And I will tell you, in the middle of the night, the guys from the Strike Eagles and the F-16s who were also in their planning were invaluable because they basically stopped all of their stuff and started working with us. Meanwhile, that's the night Roberts Ridge happens. So we don't have all those people here now, but 4 Strike Eagle personnel and a F-16 crew member won Silver Stars that night while we were planning, and we got their data back from them that morning as things went on. And then they were able to get in that night and escort the helicopters off when they went in to pick the people up who got shot down. Nothing was resolved by 9 a.m.
So tell me a little bit about what the sorties are like. So you get there and there's so much that happens. We read a lot of medal citations, but what is it like when you arrive, SOUP and K9, and then the subsequent sorties? How does that progress? What is the feel? It's certainly not like showing up with a red flag. What's different about this?
Chaos.
Chaos.
Complete chaos. That's what it is. You hear airplanes everywhere. You hear people on the ground everywhere. You don't know who's talking to who. You don't know who's flying where. And it's just complete chaos. You have different people on the ground talking to different aircraft. You have aircraft doing their own thing. You don't know where anybody is, and no one's talking to anyone, or there's different fights in different locations, and no one knows what's going on. And when they say go in and fix it, you've got to go in, and the first thing is take control, which is really figuring out who's who, where they are, and who's flying where. Because you got airplanes cutting across everywhere. You've got UAVs in one location that has no idea as bombers are coming across there, and different ground parties, as well as the terminal controllers in different locations. And even K9 talked about earlier the fact that, they were dropping bombs with other people south of where they thought they weren't. And so figuring out where they were and then deconflicting those people and clearing them out of the area. It was complete chaos.
So it's even worse than that.
My word wasn't good enough. Let me hand it over to my squadron commander now.
That's a great picture of it from a cockpit. You're going to go plan or actually execute major campaigns in the future. You talk usually in kill chains. There may have been like 4 different kill chains, 4 different command responsibilities in the same place. Commissioner Army, 101st and 10th Mountain were on the ground. They had a fight. Whitesoft was on the ground. There were some other players on the ground. And plus you had strikes going on CENTCOM nominated targets, all in the same place. And so sorting out who actually owns the battle. Is it 10th Mountain sitting up there at Bagram? Or is it the KAOC? Or are other folks sitting in other places and trying to walk into that without knowing what their plans are or who has priorities? That's what she's describing. And the night I ran the battle because the command control birds were bent. That means they weren't functional. I spent 7 hours sorting out who's in the battlefield now and what are they after? Who are you working for? And so you end up just trying to keep people from hurting each other, but trying to sort out where the priority kill chains were and the priority movements in the ground and who owns this place without knowing what the plan was. And I think the plan was probably muddled anyway. Everyone was trying to help. A lot of great Americans were in the midst of this trying to do the right thing. But it was chaotic from a command and control standpoint of who owned the battle overall in theater between the CFLIC and the CFAC. And then who on the ground thought they owned it. And then who's talking to each other.
So let me just say something about that from a doctrine perspective. So, yeah, the comments made that, we write doctrine and we deviate from it. I got that. But the real issue here is we had, in doctrinal terms, multiple supported commanders in the same area. You had 4 different people that thought they were the boss in an area that's 10 kilometers long and 5 kilometers wide. And you can't have that. That violates almost every rule of both command and principle of war. So as a result of that, that's one of the reasons why we had almost a near mid-air, and you've got people in the KAOC and the Air Operations Center making stuff up. Like, okay, a bomber box. Well, there's no such thing. Oh, we're going to make one for this. So, General Kelly at Air Combat Command said, don't change your kill chain on the first night of the war. Don't make something up that nobody knows what it is, because these people were coming through, dropping bombs to our guys and gals. We thought we were in charge, and then it's like, who dropped that? Who dropped looking down with MVGs at these bombs exploding below you, going, who did that? Oh, that's KAOC approved. Well, I thought you made these guys and gals in charge instead of someone back in Saudi Arabia with a 10,000-mile screwdriver. So that didn't help because they gave us a mission, a doctrinal mission type orders, and then they took their screwdriver out and started messing with us. And it took us 3 days to unmess that up.
So all the pilots, though, they showed up and they were all working with you, no issues, right?
Is that what you heard?
Yeah.
You're
So I'm
fired.
leading to I heard an interesting story today about a confrontation with an inbound bomber who had clearance dropped in your area. So I was hoping to pull that string a little bit.
The lesson is history can be your enemy, right? And stop fighting the last war. So we were fighting the last war, which had been 10 years of Operation Southern Watch, which were these things called response options. And so typically a response option, the Iraqis would break the rules that they were unaware of, or maybe they were, and we would spend 3 days coming up with a game plan to punish them that would go all the way to the White House. And so typically we would send a 45-ship package into southern Iraq to bomb radio antenna. And we would go in there with clearance from the Air Operations Center. So now all of a sudden we're in a fight that's close air support. That doesn't work. It's not how close air support works. Close air support works with, I have a young enlisted member on the ground typically who's a joint terminal attack controller, at the time enlisted terminal attack control in ETAC, who provides clearance for me to drop. We have positive target identification. The JTAC or the ETAC clears the attack and we get after it. It has to be responsive. Well, all of a sudden, to put in perspective, I'm rolling in on an attack with an AC-130 that's provided positive identification, a combat controller on the ground who gives me clearance to drop, and then the command and control aircraft, the J-Stars in this case, said aborts me on the attack. That's aborting someone on an attack is kind of a big deal. That usually means I'm about to kill friendlies. And I come off the target, I'm disciplined, I'm very well trained to not drop when I hear that word. And I ask why. And they said, because Kmart, appropriately the name for the Air Operations Center, said your attack wasn't approved. And I'm like, what are you talking about? You're 3,000 miles away from this fight. So I adhered to it. I came off. It's a promise to the folks on the ground that I will not drop without clearance, regardless of what I think about the situation. And so I come back and they say, you need to nominate this target. And so we go through this whole thing. But the bottom line is that we went through this process because we were relearning. We spent 10 years of doing something a certain way, and we had forgotten how to execute. And doctrinally speaking, like close air support does not involve the Air Operations Center. But we had gotten through 10 years of Southern Watch and Northern Watch where we had learned this new thing. And we had forgotten doctrinally about how we're supposed to execute this type of mission. And so all of a sudden, we're in this fight and we have this confluence of bomber boxes and time-sensitive targeting overlaid with close air support. And we forgot, because the last time we did close air support, and we did very little of it, frankly, in Desert Storm. The last time we really did close air support, like robustly, was Vietnam. And we learned a lot of bad lessons. And all of a sudden, we fell into this modus operandi of like, okay, like the KAC is going to clear every target. And that is not possible. Not when you have young men and women under fire in close proximity to the enemy, which requires this integration. And it created an incredible element of difficulty in doing our job. And that's one of the big takeaways we walked away with in the end, which we did. We did an after action, 10 days later, which was, this is not what we're doing anymore. Like we don't need to evolve. That's actually the wrong word. We actually need to devolve. We need to go back to what our doctrine is. We have close air support doctrine. We know how to do this. And we chose not to do it at the threat of losing incredible men and women on the ground because we thought we were still fighting this war we had done for 10 years. And that's a huge danger that we as a community need to recognize, which is you can't keep fighting the last war. And I will say that from the standpoint of what we've done for 20 years, prior to leaving Iraq and Afghanistan, it's not the peer competitor war. I get that. I don't want it to be, but we need to recognize that, like, okay, then what does it look like going forward? Let's stop fighting the last war and try to apply it to the future conflict. When you talk about doctrine, like to El Cid's point, and I'm the one who said it, and I say it all the time, and it pains General Wright for me to say this, which is in the United States Air Force, doctrine is a point of departure, which is very dangerous. We have doctrine for a reason. And I don't mean to be dogmatic about it, but you can't just say, this is what we're going to do in this situation. And then we end up in this situation, we go, yeah, whatever, let's go do this thing. And typically it's what we did last. And so we learned a very harsh lesson in this moment because of these, like what El Cid was talking about, these bombers and trying to do TST in a cast fight and everything else, because everybody said this was successful in the last 10 years. The last 10 years isn't now. And we as an Air Force and a joint force need to realize that.
I want to talk a little bit about is we're coming from the first sortie where there's a great deal of chaos. We're working through it. And as we send the next pilots, they come back and they're kind of debriefing here at Jacobabad. And as you're taking in that information, you know you have to send out the next pilots. What's kind of the things we're getting past is there's chaos up there. How am I going to brief the next crews? What am I going to tell the next crews to go up? And then what are you thinking as you got kind of that debrief as you're going into this uncertainty and you know there's chaos and you're going to have to fix it? How does that mentality go? What are you thinking?
Well, so Soup brings up the fact that they were learning in the AOC also, and there were a number of spirited conversations. So Soup and I, after his second sortie, because we launched him out, as soon as we get there and I'm building the bomb dump and everything, and then we go yank him out of bed, break crew rest, launch him out again, because they think they found Osama bin Laden. And that's why we broke all the rules and we launched them out again. But after that, it was another chaotic day, night, when no one was ostensibly in charge. And so we wrote spins. We actually sat there on a computer and wrote spins. Meanwhile,
Spins?
Special instructions.
special instructions. We wrote rules for this fight for basically the kill box that was in, which is the area. It was a 30 by 30 container that included Gardez and the whale and all that stuff. And a classmate of mine, Vinny DeFranzo, was the chief of combat operations on the floor back in the AOC. So I spent most of that night talking to him about how we were going to unmess this thing up. And so they started briefing the aircrew. Keep in mind, though, that half of these sorties out there were coming from the Navy. So we were having to tell those guys to stop. And then there were national asset people flying things that want to tell you that you're not the boss of them. And so we had to tell them, no, we are. And that went on for several days until ultimately, about the time we left, if one of us said something to somebody on the radio, to an airborne platform up there, less the 160th, who will always be on my list, we could control, at least keep them from getting blown up. I mean, when she and I flew together, I'm on the radio screaming, helicopters approaching, the whale, say call sign, turn away, because I had cleared a B-52 to drop. And so we ended up having to abort the B-52, who was very unhappy. I spent as much time on the phone typing, writing with them, and every time they would come back, I would say, what was it like? What was it like? Mumbles helped a lot too when he wasn't flying for those first couple of days. I'd like to hear what you thought about how, because you were on the phone or writing with me as we put that stuff together.
Certainly, it was interesting. So if anybody's watched Masters of the Air, so you remember they sit in the tower and they're waiting for everybody to come back. Well, I can tell you, waiting for the guys to come back from when we were at Jacobabad, waiting for people to come in and land, we had the same feelings. Are they going to make it? Are they going to make it? Are they going to make it? And then when you finally heard them, it did give a big sigh of relief. So that's something that was amazing. So that's a reality because it actually happened to us as well. When the pilots came back, we did have a chance. These guys were exhausted, okay? So when they landed in Jacobabad, they were absolutely exhausted. I mean, that was a long flight from Kuwait, down to Pensacola and all the way up to West Virginia. That was a long flight. And then all the stress of trying to unmess up the AOR, that's a lot of stress. And so these guys came back, they were exhausted. So we tried to get as much information out of them as we could, but also we had to get them to bed. I mean, they were exhausted. So we knew we didn't have a lot of pilots there at that time. So they knew they were going to fly again. We realized, and then as El Cid said, luckily he has friends in high places. He had the opportunity to call people. So as he's calling, he'd say, Mumbles, go work this, Mumbles, go do this. Because I was with him on the very first, it's interesting, Jacobabad. We were not there when the first airplanes landed. No. We tried. So the A-10s got to Jacobabad before we did. Before our maintenance guys did. So the guys there at Jacobabad weren't A-10 guys, but they recovered our airplanes. And again, it was wonderful. But it was weird that I'm sure they felt strange when they landed at Jacobabad and there was nobody there. Okay, where is everybody? Am I at the right place? I'm sure, those kind of things.
We turned them though. That first night we stayed
sure
up
did.
And so when we landed after they were in bed, then we turned the airplanes thinking they weren't going to fly again, because the rules was you're only going to fly at night, because they didn't want to see the A-10s taken off during the day on our humanitarian missions. But then when it looked like they found the mother of all targets, they blew that off.
Yep.
Yeah, that was interesting. Mumbles, go get soup out of the shower. You guys are taking off. You guys are flying. What? To go get soup. Find him. So no kidding. He was in the shower.
You're welcome.
Yeah, exactly.
Add on to what you were saying, the 4th, 2 sorties, Soup and K9, the 2-ship, long mission. They land, they get put to bed. Advon gets there.
Yep.
Looks at jets over a little bit, just a couple minutes, guys, with that.
Yep.
The next day, they launch out again. Pop-Tart is airborne.
Yep.
Who are you with that day?
Chow.
With Chaw. So there is the next 2 airplanes coming in. They land, then the main body gets in that night. C-17 with 30 more maintenance guys, all kinds of munitions, and all the equipment. And then they set up camp. And so we go 2 fight days before a very small party, but a maintenance body, and the rest of ops. And we had 11 pilots total when we all count our noses here. On the 6th of March, we've been fighting 4th and 5th. So it was a come as you are, get out there, and figure it out when you get there on the sports side as well.
And by the way, sleep is a weapon, because some of us hadn't been to bed for almost 3 days.
I remember that.
Yeah, I probably didn't look so good.
Oh, just who you yelled at. We just landed, we're unloading all conditions. He starts yelling to us. I didn't know what's going on. Never mind.
I was yelling?
Oh, yeah.
I was surprised I was still awake.
He was organizing. He was organizing with a loud voice.
So there's yelling, screaming.
I apologize.
There's uncertainty what friendlies are doing, and who's going to yell at who, but who's the enemy. A lot of people don't get off the fighting themselves. Who's in charge? Who has priorities? Who owns the resources? And what are we about? Whether it's KAOC, whether it's 10th Mountain, you learn that in combat every time. That there's so much friction, not just uncertainty, but friction amongst the friendly side, much less what the enemy is doing. And that's always been my takeaway.
Sure.
Yeah. Your worst enemy, I thought, was Al-Qaeda or the Iraqis or whoever they are. How come it's the KAOC? Or pick your enemy. The friendlies try and get along. All those hard, good questions. Sorry.
No, not at all. There's a lot of creativity that happens throughout these missions to deal with some of the uncertainty, the lack of resources. Nelson, we've talked before about it, but I'd like to hear it again. You don't just call up flight service and get to Jacobabad. You got to get real creative there, don't you?
So one of the things that happened, by the way, we had reopened the air routes. The air routes over Gardez and the Shawkat Valley reopened on 1 March. So the Pakis could make money and the Afghanis could make money.
Flying civilian
airliners back over there. So the civilian airline routes opened back up on the 1st of March. And then on the 2nd, we put B-52s there. And we had to close them. But they didn't get them closed right away. So what we ended up having to do was, I'm on the phone saying, hey, we got airliners going. People are saying there's airliners up here too in the midst of this, because they had offset the orbits. So part of that was the international part. Part of that was the part at Jacobabad, because I couldn't talk. I didn't have the comm normally, to talk to the tower or whatever it would be. And then the other aspect of it was, how do you communicate with our bosses? Because I kept getting called from the embassy saying, this is what the president of the United States wants. This is what the ambassador wants. And you don't just blow those people off, even though you're working for the air component commander.
And you haven't any sleep.
Oh, yeah. And I haven't had any sleep yet. That's okay. I took some sleeping pills and it was all better.
We talked a little bit about Doctrine being present for a reason, but also figuring things out in combat. And there's a really neat TTP that gets developed that's now in our JFire that anybody doing CAS is going to learn. And so I think that's an interesting story to talk about here, because it dealt with sharing airspace with the gunship, the AC-130, and you're both trying to attack the same targets. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how that TTP developed on the fly there and how you guys kind of used it.
It was actually established, but little used at the time. And we call it the perch. And so the gunship flies in an orbit, so left-hand turn, like NASCAR. So with our speed, which is still slow but faster than AC-130, is you stack up above them and you fly outside their orbit. And so what that allows you to do for the physics majors in the room, I'm a management major, is you can park yourself on their wing above them and fly a longer circle at a slightly higher speed. But you're matched. You're sitting in formation with them. And so what it allows to do, so the gunship has almost 8 hours, generally speaking, depending on where they're stationed, in this case at Bagram. They almost have 8 hours of station time. They have a lot of ordnance, but they don't have 8 hours of ordnance if you're in a serious fight. And so the idea is if we get up there, then they can save their ordnance while we're on station, and we can kill things they can't, believe it or not, because we can kill armor. They can't kill armor. And in this case, it wasn't an armor fight, but what we allowed them to do is stay on station longer with more weapons, because while we're there, if we're expending all our weapons, they're saving their weapons for when we go away to the tanker or we've got to recover. It was probably night 2, night 4, I can't remember, where I said, hey, let's get up on the gunship. Because the gunship's got something. So the gunship has this awesome thing called we call it the burn. And they can illuminate with infrared energy a football field. And if you're a bad guy and you have night vision goggles, I would never want to see this, because it's the scariest thing on the planet. Because when they're out there combing the hills, you'll watch these infrared floodlights moving around, and all of a sudden they'll stop, and you know the hate's coming. And then you'll just start seeing 40 millimeter or 105 millimeter come down because they found a target. And so they use it as a target illuminator. And so for us, you're in an A10A, so we don't have all the gizmos the new A10 has. We have night vision goggles. That's it. We don't have a targeting pod. We don't have any of that stuff. So finding targets at night is nearly impossible for us, unless it's shooting at you, then you shoot back. And in this case, we were like, all right, let's jump up on the gunship. And so we get into this. It's like a couple of vultures sitting over a bigger vulture. It's really mean. It's unfair to the enemy, but it's good for our guys and gals on the ground. And so we get up there and we just jump on the perch. And I said to Ken, let's get on the perch, because I can't find anything. They're finding stuff. Let's have them find it for us. And so they just start combing the earth with the burn. And then they have this really cool thing called NISLID. I'd be challenged to give you the actual acronym. It's the infrared pointer that goes down in the middle of the football field of infrared illumination of a dot, which is hit the dot. I can't see what's down there, but they can tell me what's down there. And they're like, underneath the dot is a bunch of bad dudes. And so we would roll off of their wing, and so they would be hammering away. And as soon as I would come off their wing above them, I would yell that I was rolling in. They would stop shooting. We would shoot, come off, and then get back up on their wing. And as soon as I called I was clear of their orbit, they would start hammering the target again. So you would just put unbelievable pressure on the enemy, which put unbelievable relief on friendly forces, because they never got to pick their head up off the ground. Because as a team, we could just crush them nonstop pressure. So our friendly forces could either disengage or escape or regroup. And so it was an unbelievable tactic that we had tactics for, but we had never unleashed it. And this was our first opportunity to go in there and do it. And it was unbelievable, what we could do. And it was a great example at the time, which was probably unrealized, of what Air Force Special Operations Command and Air Combat Command could do together, which we would later codify as Combat Air Forces, which is what we call Air Combat Command Fighter Forces, and Special Operations. So together, instead of doing our own things, which is what we were doing the first night. Like the AC-130s were doing their thing. K9 and I had no idea that Roberts Ridge had happened. None. It had happened, and the AC-130s were trying to get those guys off the mountaintop. We had no idea it was going on. We were out there supporting conventional Army, but if we had known, back to command and control, because soft special operations folks were talking through a different channel than the conventional Army, we could have provided a force multiplier. Luckily, the second night, and this is like the big takeaway, is captains figuring stuff out. Like, it's not the generals. And as a senior officer, I can accept that I'm part of the problem, or I was. Not anymore. But captains will figure things out. And in this case, it was the captain AC-130 aircraft commander and our flight coming together and going, whoa, we can do way more together than working apart from each other in this AOR. And so in this case, we got together, and that became a standing tactic for us. The rest of the week or so we were doing Anaconda was leveraging the AC-130 because we knew what our weakness was. Our weakness was we had no targeting pods. We had none of the fancy stuff that the A-10C has. The A-10A, we had NVGs and an infrared Maverick. That was it. And it was useless, almost. And so the gunship provided a force multiplier to us, and we provided a force multiplier to them based on the weapons set that we had. And all of a sudden, we're like, hey, if we start working together, we already have this tactic, why don't we use it? And all of a sudden, for the next week, we just started crushing targets as a team instead of being two independent entities, even with our own service.
That's beautiful. So we go from this chaos to finally getting it organized, getting it put together, and now we're unleashing the full capability of air power, and that's beautiful. I'd like to use that to a point to transition to kind of our next real big thing, to talk about agile combat employment, working from austere bases. And I know there's 1,000 stories on this. You did both Jacobabad and eventually Bagram. As an airman going into a bare base, dude, that kind of set, what can I expect? What did you learn? Just throw that out there.
I think the first thing that I would say is I sent Mumbles from Jacobabad. There's another guy up there, actually General Horner's son, who was also an A-10 guy, had been sent up there by General Mosley. So I sent Mumbles up there to take a look at Bagram. So Mumbles, tell me what you came back and told me.
I got what they had. How I got up there was they had regular C-130 flights into Bagram, and that's how they got the fuel for the Army. All the choppers were there. They had a huge bladder in the back of a 130, and then they would land, lights out, and then they would defuel. And so I get off the airplane, and I've never been in a place that is so dark in my life. I get off, I walk like maybe 15 feet from the 130, I turn around and I can't see it. I mean, it is black. So I'm following these guys to figure out no idea where I'm going. I go back and this is early in the morning, and the light sun starts coming up, and I go kind of walking around, and I see all these people in black uniforms that I have never seen before. People with beards and things that, I don't see nothing that I recognized. I go, this is unusual. So I walk and I go over to, they had a control tower. That's where that picture is being taken from. The picture that you see there is being taken from the control tower. And if anybody ever saw the movie Patton, and you noticed where he walks into one of his headquarters in Germany, and all the way around the door, there's bullet holes. Well, all around the door, there was bullet holes. So I go in there, the horn dog's there. We go look at, assess the environment. There were sappers, which are people who are trained to look for landmines with both, the ones I saw were using bayonets on their hands and knees in the dirt along the path that I had walked back from the C-130. Okay, I was on the pave, anything dirt. what you see behind there is after we built Tent City. Before then, there was no tents, no buildings, but there was a tank with its turret blown off. All right, so we did have that. There was another pit that a vehicle was stuck into. That's when we end up building a latrine, P-tubes, PVC pipes into P-stone, and get to go out and go see the runway. And it's a early 60s Soviet runway. And the way that they built their runways was they had these giant concrete slabs, probably, I can't remember how big they were, but probably 30 by 60. And they would keep spare slabs off to the side so the runways got blown up. They could just take that one out, all the clutter, and put a new one in. Well, one side of the runway, half the runway, was gone. There's only half the runway from a width-wise, and about 3/4 of the runway, it was also that bad on the other side. So it was like, this place is unbelievable. We drove around to the other side where there were revetments. Okay, there were MiG-21s in the revetments that we had destroyed with cluster munitions. So they're still sitting there in the revetments. We'll continue to look all around. They're seeing what the situation. And this is as bare a base. I mean, for an Air Force guy, I mean, Jacobabad was fine. I mean, I'm used to, U.S. Air Force bases, I mean, we've got an O Club. Come on now, Oh, you go to the tower, and downstairs, there were Special Operations Forces that was their hooch. That's where they lived. So this place was very interesting. I did my assessment. I come back home and, yep, I'm known for this. I go, boss, that is the scariest place I have ever been to in my life. And it was, because, I mean, those guys were no kidding at war. That was an Army base in the middle of a combat zone. And I'm going, I don't know how the A-10s are going to be operating from there, because there really wasn't a runway. There wasn't any facilities. But
8 days later, you were back.
Yep, and we made it happen.
I will tell you, I took on the Advon, Mumbles, and Soup, and Pop-Tart, and I gave them all a different job after we helped build the first tents. I mean, the first rule that I had when I was there is, you can't tell me that's not my job, because your job is whatever needs to be done, And so the second day, I'm digging a latrine.
Yeah.
So a young soldier walks up to me and says, hey, I'm looking for the A-10 commander. I don't have my blouse on. I'm just in a T-shirt. I go, so why? And he goes, my dad said I needed to find you guys. As it turns out, so a dear friend of all of ours was a guy named Robert Brown, Muck Brown. And he said, you guys saved my life. And I said, what night was it? When was it? Or whatever. So K-9 actually could tell the rest of the story, because he was the one that dropped the bomb that saved his life. Go ahead.
And then
nice segue. Yeah, so it was actually about 3 months after we got back. I was at a change of command for the 75th Fighter Squadron, and P.J. Johnson, who won the Cross in Desert Storm, was handing off the squadron to Bino Turner. Bino just passed away a couple weeks ago and laid to rest last week. I was at the change of command, and Muck's wife comes up to me, Catherine Brown. I didn't know who she was. She says, are you K-9? And I was just back in the cheap seats. I said, yes, ma'am. And she goes, you saved my son's life. And I said, I'm not sure what you're talking about. She says, no, he was with 10th Mountain over in the Shaikat Valley. You were the guy that dropped the first bomb over there, right? And I go, well, yeah, but I was number 2. Soup led the mission. It was when we went over there, and I remember when we got back from the big mission, the second mission, I told Soup, we got 2,700 more to go. So we were getting BDA that was 200 to 300 guys. And I was like, my reckoning was the towers was 3,000. We got 300. We need 2,700 more to even the score. And at that point, I was in a vengeance kind of mindset, which I saw the slideshow you had up here, Vengeance is Mine, saith the Lord. And I was like, when at the early outset of the whole thing, I was like, that's why I'm there. I'm here to even the score. I was a pissed off Yank and going over there to get the people who knocked down the towers. But this brought it all home when Mrs. Brown says to me that, hey, you saved my son. That's what A-10 guys are all about. A-10 pilots is, helping somebody who's having a bad day. Whether they're a downed airman we're doing a CSAR for, which is what we went over there initially for an OSW, or if it's a close air support, which is our bread and butter mission. And that's, some 18-year-old snuffy with a rifle sitting behind a rubble wall or in a foxhole, wishing he was anywhere on the earth but where he's at right now, because it's a bad day and he's taking fire and didn't know if he and his buddies are going to come out of it. And so that brought it all home for me, and it turned it from, I'm just not over here wreaking vengeance. We're over here protecting our buddies who are out there doing the job. So it was a grounding event for me.
Donk,
Sir,
what's the bottom of your email always say?
Find ways to say yes. For a young warrior, may depend on what you do today.
yeah.
Here.
Absolutely. I want to use that to transition, just talk a little bit more about the bear base there. We're going to talk a little bit about risk. And I think that we talk about taking risk.
Wow.
And that really is sometimes it's not worth the risk. And the story you just told brings it home, because it goes, we don't always know whose risk we're avoiding. It could be somebody getting the airplane airborne, could be mitigating the risk for somebody we don't even know. And I think that's beautiful. And I want to talk a little bit about what is it like to accept risk, and what does the risk look like at these bear bases? Because it's something that is totally different. There was a story earlier about the worst EP the A-10 could have at Bagram was a blown tire. And so I kind of want to pull on that just to give our airmen here an idea of what this bear base is like.
Well, we didn't have much when we got there, and like Mumble said, the runway wasn't anything that normally you would fly in or out of. Stoop and I did the thawed walk or ride. We had a golf cart with a little bucket on the back, and we were trying to pick up rocks before the A-10s came in. We started with pebbles, and finally, what was it? A dip can. If it wasn't bigger than a dip can, it wasn't even worth picking up, because there was so much out there that we couldn't even do it. So we were just trying to find rocks that were this big, and if they're big as that, we'd take them off, and otherwise we just couldn't even do it. Yes, exactly. But we didn't even have approaches to get in or out of the airfield. We didn't know how we were going to get above the mountains and back in. I was tasked with, you need to figure it out and write an approach. So I went out there. I was working with the tower guys. I'm the one that wrote the approaches for the A-10s to fly into Bagram. I figured out how we were going to fly out of Bagram, how we were going to come around and fly the pattern. I have zero experience in doing that. I just looked at how we did it at home, what the altitudes were, exactly how we worked, if we came back in the weather and staying above the mountains. But in terms of the EPs, you talk about that hole in the runway, we had to figure out how we were going to deal with the EPs. So when he's talking about taking off from the runway with half the runway blown out, we had to figure out, usually the lead aircraft was on the side with the hole in the runway. So when you release brakes, you took off and then you swerved over so you were in front of your wingman before you took off, so your wingman could go straight ahead and didn't have to worry about the hole in the runway, which was pretty much half of the runway that was missing. So the blown tire issue was, if you blew your tire before you got there, what were you going to do? Rip your landing gear off in the giant hole or eject? And those were kind of the issues we would talk about. And that's why the blown tire EP was a very significant issue, because of taking off on that runway. If you hit that hole, on what your options were going to be based on the airspeed if it happened before the giant hole in the runway.
You were ejecting into what?
A minefield.
Yes.
Yeah, because there was mines all over the place.
1 million mines in the Shawinigan Valley.
Yeah, that hadn't been.
Had the mine thing, because it had been laid by 5 different organizations.
Yeah,
Nobody knew where they were.
We weren't even there but before we left, which we were only there a few weeks before we were getting replaced, they brought over these massive machines that spun chains and beat up the ground all the way around the runway to explode all of the landmines that were out there. And the windows on these vehicles were wicked thick, and they were cracked. So unbelievably brave, those people that were out there beating
And
up
every
the
time an
ground.
explosion happened, we had to go do another pod walk.
Yeah.
Because I picked
Yep.
up, I have a picture of remember that piece of bomb?
Oh, yeah.
There was a piece of bomb that was this big that we picked up off the runway because it got blown up when they hit, an anti-tank mine?
Yeah, that's that Polish mine flailer.
Yeah.
Big chain taken out of commission by an anti-tank mine. You knocked us out off our cots, which we're using as chairs around the mission planning table. We thought we were under attack. Yeah, I was going to back up. Big picture. This is like the Berlin airlift. Only thing coming through the gates at Bagram was grapple. Everything else had to be flown in. Everything you ate, anything you planned with, munitions, fuel, everything had to be flown in. Steady stream of C-17s. We were only using 3,000 feet of runway because they can, and to take off because they can. Every time one rotated with all those huge engines, machine gun belts, helicopter parts, UXOs, sheet metal, you have to go out and clear afterwards because it was a hazardous for everybody else. Going back to the airspace piece, the battle, who's in charge? My big takeaway is you go into an austere field and you already have units there. One, are they qualified to run an airfield? In our case, they were not. The only guys who probably could were the Army aviation units that had a clue. But the rest of the Army, including all special ops folks, were just running amok all around it. And by the end of May, and we left, we had like 300 bumper stickers of war stories that you couldn't believe this also happened. From finding grenades on runways to fuel barrels to people trying to shoot mortars over airplanes to sight them in. That was a good day.
That was one.
We avoided that one.
Yeah.
But you're taxiing along, and here comes a dune buggy out of the infield across the runway taxiway, just doing what he wants to do. Where's he going? I mean, how many people just drive onto airfields or airports? I mean, it was an uncontrolled environment. And so she and who else helped you? Was that Chaw?
With the
airbase, we published an airbase ops manual, standard doctrine. This is what you do is you don't kill people. You can't go do calisthenics if you're the British SAS in front of the arming area on the taxiway. You can't build munitions dumps. You can't build hospitals inside the big clear zone of a munitions dump, which they were doing, 2 of them. Wild West show back east, anything would go. And we were very fortunate that we did not kill people beyond a Norwegian miner, sapper that blew his face off just as we got there, and the Polish mine flailer. That guy was okay. You want to tell your story about almost hitting a mine flailer?
I'm coming down to land. I'm cleared to land. And all of a sudden, there's a mine flailer on the runway. I didn't hit him, but that would have been bad for both of us because I was a full bomb load, and those guys were not paying attention. And the hardest thing I had to do as the airfield commander was to get people to recognize I was the airfield commander. So one morning, we had the 160th running on the runway, and C-17 had to come in and do this swap ins low approach. I had my cops arrest them, and they said, "You can't arrest us." And it's like, yeah, I can. And I said, "These guys have guns. You don't have guns. Zip tie them until Colonel comes in and gets you out of here." I mean, you almost cost a C-17 to crash. And all of these disparate organizations out here that says you're not the boss of me caused eventually CENTCOM to create a doctrine called the Senior Airfield Authority, which enabled us to move down that road better in Iraq. Many of the lessons we learned in Afghanistan, we did better in Iraq, but still, because of Black Hawk Down and all the soldiers bunking in the hangars, I tried to convince General Hagenbach, it's like hangars be for airplanes, tents be for soldiers, but we could never break that paradigm because we were flying concrete in to pour pads when they already existed to fix aircraft on.
So one thing I want to bring about the airfield too, which people might find interesting. So we talked to the bomb dump. So the bomb dump was on the other side of the airfield. And you normally, we have security forces that would guard your bomb dump. We had the Northern Alliance was guarding our bomb dump on the other side of the field.
For $100 a week.
And we got the opportunity regularly to go over there and break bread with them. And that was, they loved that part.
Command that.
Yeah, command. Yeah.
Command that.
Even more so, take your flight surgeon over and treat them, because that's the biggest thing they wanted was some help with all their ailments.
Yeah.
These are former Soviet-trained avionics, hydraulics, munitions officers in the Afghan Air Force. Now,
And the MREs, they liked MREs.
They did like MREs.
So yeah, we take over stuff for the need too. So we've take away a lesson: befriend the locals who are helping you, build some rapport, especially when they're guarding your munitions.
They knew who the bad guys were and who were not the bad guys.
And where the minefields.
I want to open it up for our guests. I've hogged the stage long. The question's long enough, and you guys have shared a lot. I know I got one ready to go here. Dr. Jordan?
Good evening, all of you. It's been a pleasure. One of the things that y'all have touched on tonight is the clearance for fires and the coordination that comes from the Tactical Air Control Party, or the TACP, that we know and love. But the hidden story behind that is the Army didn't want to bring their TACPs. And Mike Longoria, the 06, who was the colonel, who was the air liaison officer to the land component commander, forced the issue and deployed TACPs into the Army units so that there was a seam that could be crossed. On the other hand, what would have happened in your minds, and how difficult would have been your mission if that deployment had not occurred, if the TACPs, that seam of war, had not been closed at the last minute? Thank you.
I'll start. We would have had a lot of emergency, what we call emergency close air support. Find someone on the ground who actually can talk to us and do the best they can. And we take the risk. So we had SOF and we had conventional JTACs, joint terminal air attack controllers on the ground, or ground FACs, forward air controllers on the ground, who I thought did a great job, as hard as this was, of sorting out who, like they say, friendlies are 2 kilometers to the west. And I'd ask them, is that you? Yes. Do you know where everybody else is? Go do a roll call, check all the other units, especially over the ridges. There's all kinds of terrain, all kinds of line of sight problems. I want confirmation that you know where everybody is before we employ, because there are scattered units everywhere of different flavors. And generally, we would find a party on the ground who had the best situational awareness in the middle of the night, do the roll call, and they can paint us a picture. We're okay on this direction, dropping these weapons, and sorting out. If we hadn't had those, if we didn't have an ASOC that was functional, we really didn't have a close air support network that was airborne that was schooled in how to do this. We had to start on the ground and have them count noses in order to figure out where the fights were and who was in trouble, who wasn't in trouble, and where everybody was. And it's kind of like hair warm, not on fire. We want to be deliberate with a sense of urgency and energy to get fought, but not at the expense of making some serious errors that you read about later. And even with that, most stories I departed from, all 3 of them, leaving the area, said, well, this is on a secure radio to my wingman. I think we did okay, but if we didn't, we'll have phone calls. We just did not know because of how chaotic it was. To answer your question, it would have been near impossible except finding someone who had the wit to get on a radio and talk to somebody, if they knew where they were.
There were 30, so to put it in perspective, it's hard to imagine this. So 9 clicks by 5 clicks, if you're familiar with the United States Air Force Academy, 18,000 acres, that is 9 clicks by 5 clicks. That may sound like a lot. I ask you to put it into perspective, because if I put it into miles, I'm not going to do the conversion because I'm not a math major. There were 37 JTACs in that ground space. So typically, if an enemy mortar or RPG hit, you would get 3 JTACs who would call troops in contact. And frequently, they weren't talking to each other because there was no ASOC. So that's what the Air Support Operations Center does, generally speaking, is correlating all of that data from all of those ground controllers, those enlisted terminal attack controllers, as we called them then. And they knew where they were. They would plot where the hit was, and they would figure out who needed the support. Instead, we were left, K9, when we got on station the first night, I made my decision based on the pitch of their voice. That was it. We had 3 JTACs call for close air support, troops in contact. One of them called for ECAS, emergency close air support, which meant they were not a qualified joint terminal attack controller, which most likely meant the ETAC was already hit, and they were probably a forward observer, an artillery forward observer. And so he and I had a quick conversation and said, who do we support? They're all screaming. This kid's voice is the highest octave. It's not scientific. And it may not even be effective, but that's what we had. And normally I had somebody who was grounded, literally sitting there on the ground at 0 knots and 1 G, who could take all that information in and there was no emotion to it. They just looked at it and they said, this is what's going on, these are the units involved, this is the priority of effort, go support that person. Well, we were left with, who sounds scared? More scared, because they were all scared. And we heard the bullets flying by. And so we had no ASOC. I can't imagine what things looked like without all of our ETACs and JTACs. And I will tell you, and Surgeon can attest to this, was a year later, okay? So this is the craziness. Let me give you some perspective. When we got to Bagram, we started talking about we were finishing up in Afghanistan, okay? March 2002. We're done here. That was it. So we were being told, because we're moving on to Iraq. And so 1003 Victor, which was the operations plan for Iraq, which Pope would then execute in support of JSOC a year later, was the new bright, shiny object. We were done with Afghanistan. Afghanistan's done. We're about closed for business. This thing is closed up, put a bow on it. This operation's over. We have to worry about it. We're going to move on to the next great thing. I will tell you, and Surgeon can attest to this, so at the time, the 2 Pope squadrons, we were 24 primary aircraft available squadrons. The reason we had 24 jets and we were manned at 2 pilots per jet, so 48 pilots per squadron, was because we had a requirement to support the Army. We had 12 battalion air liaison officers. I was one. I was assigned to the 3rd of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment at the 82nd Airborne when I was a lieutenant. Was like, that's what we had to provide the Army. Well, going to OEF, the Army didn't see the value of Joint Terminal Attack Controllers or battalion ALOs. When we went to Iraq, guess who left all of the fighter squadrons? Because if the Army went first, the fighter squadrons lost all those pilots to be, and I say lost in a certain respect, but if the Army said, we're taking our Belos, the fighter squadrons lost those pilots. We were manned to absorb that. And I will tell you that during the early days of Afghanistan, the Army didn't understand the value of Joint Terminal Attack Controllers. I will tell you, after Anaconda, the Army didn't go anywhere with their JTACs and their Belos and everything else, because before Iraq, we got cleaned out. Both the 74th and 75th Fighter Squadron Belos were gone. They were all deployed for Iraqi freedom because they suddenly understood what the value of those airmen embedded in their Army units brought to the fight. And it changed, by the way, I'm not going to offer an opinion on it, you'll probably know where I stand, but we got rid of the Belo program because the Air Force couldn't afford it. Like, we couldn't afford the payment from a fighter squadron to keep a combat mission ready fighter pilot who was also when I was a Belo, I was a qualified JTAC, fully qualified. I had to be jump qualified. I had to do the radios. I had to call in controls. I had to do all of that stuff on top of being a fighter pilot. And eventually the Air Force said, we can't do this anymore because they were taxing the Air Force because they realized the value these airmen brought to their units. And we had to relook the whole thing. So it was a very interesting sea change in how the Air Force and the Army worked together after particularly Anaconda.
As I listened to all this, and we started off with uncertainty, and I go back when I was somewhere along the way, somebody was telling me what the job of a military warfighter is about the application of violence to achieve an objective in an uncertain environment. Okay, and if I look at the 4 missions that I flew over there and compare them, and then start trying to say, okay, what enabled us to get it right in those 4 missions? It was the ability, we were trained as officers to be able to look at a situation and know when it was the right call to apply violence, know when it was the right call to get more information, know when it was the right call to say, Uncle, there's nothing more we can do here. It's time to say, let's take a break. Just real briefly, the very first target that Soup and I had engaged was a mortar position. And it's not like a big truck or a helicopter sitting out there. So there was a little bit of complication, and the speed at which the prosecution of that target happened was like in 5 minutes. Soup shows up, he takes the hammer, he's working through the talk-on, he throws some marks down. They say, hey, the target is 800 meters closer to the friendlies from where the marks are. Soup goes, hey, you in a position to roll in? I go, I am, can I have the radios? And then with a quick talk-on, I'm able to say, hey, I got 5 mortar pits here. This is what they look like. Is that what we're talking about? Yeah, tally target, I'm in west, and we're hitting target. There's a level of uncertainty there, but it's measured. And as I rolled in, I was 95%, 98%. I don't know what the percentage was, but I was pretty confident that we're getting ready to drop the target that was giving these guys the problem. But as I let the bombs go, oh God, please let that have been the right target. And then there was a shack too, and everything comes good. The second target was the mother lode that Soup and I got put in on. A massive target on a goat trail in high mountains with lots of karst and big rocks. I mean, from the altitude we were dropping, you couldn't break any of that out. And the guys on the ground couldn't see the target valley. So as Soup ends up putting 2 marks down on the target, the JTACs can't see it, or the SOTACs. And so Soup goes, hey, 2, can you put a target or put a mark out in the main valley about a click west of where I just put those marks down? Maybe they can see that, and we'll say, is it the valley that's up from there? And that's how we got the eyes on, and then we prosecute the target, and it ends up being a big target. Once again, there's a measure of uncertainty that you're dealing with, but Soup is managing that, and he's working all the resources with the SOTAC, JTAC on the ground, and me to get it figured out. Third target, I was with Colonel Dahl. Surgeon and I are up hitting, we get targeted eventually against the helicopter that was up on top of Takragar that started this whole thing. Not the one that Roberts fell out of, but the QRF that went in there and it got shot down. Well, now the helicopter's up there 5 days into the war, and it's being exploited. And there's guys, in there pulling stuff out of it. And so we got a SOTAC that's 600 meters away across the valley up on another mountain. He's like, that's your target. And then there's a question about whether we got clearance and went back to the J-Stars, Stiletto. And so we worked it. Now the target's very pointed, but the question is, do we have authority to hit it? Frankly, Surgeon and I can't figure that out because we have to rely on the guys on the ground. So it's going through the Stiletto, which is the J-Stars, back to the mothership, and eventually we get the clearance to go on. 100% certainty we got the right target, but do we have the authority? And we eventually get that sorted out. And then my last mission, which Surgeon at the end of this whole thing asked me, he goes, hey, K9, what was your best mission? Which one? And it was the mission I never dropped on. Because that's a mission I end up calling Uncle on. I go, this doesn't make sense. So we get in there. I was working a target with Frag Hayden, or working a target area. We had a gunship. We're trying to sort some stuff out. And then a raging firefight starts up about 6 or 7 kilometers away. And so we look over there, and I go, hey, I don't know if you see that north and west. We're going that way. So we depart, and we go trucking over there. And as we get there, it's a north-south fight. You got big guns in the south shooting at smaller guns from the north. But we don't know who's who. Surfing frequencies. We finally get a frequency to come up on. Now, once again, we're trying to sort out uncertainty because I don't even know who's in the north and who's in the south. So I have no idea what's going on. So I'm talking to these guys, and I'm like, hey, I get a guy up on their frequency, and I know he's friendly, and I know he's being shot at because he's been humping the boonies. He's absolutely out of breath. And he's scared. And he's like, I go, hey, where are you guys? And where's the fire coming at that you're worried about? Fire's coming from the south. Okay, I got a crew serve weapon, I think, in the south. He goes, yeah, that's the bad guys. Okay, so can you strobe your position? So I asked him to strobe his position, which is put an IR. He turns an IR light. We got the goggles on, and like everybody out there on the net strobes. So I got like 30 strobes going. We got a Christmas tree. So I'm like, okay, I have solved nothing now. So we got to get, once again, we got to get this uncertainty solved. So I said, hey, everybody but White Lightning 2 Bravo or 2-0, turn your strobes off. And they all start dropping. And eventually I got one strobe. And then we have a gunship shows up and he goes, hey, do you see the strobe? Can you burn it? So he burns it. I'm trying to get an idea of what's down there. And then another gunship, so we had 2 gunships on, another gunship shows up and he's like, hey, I've got 3 guys with glint tape about 300 meters south requesting clearance to engage. I'm like, who's wearing glint tape over here but U.S. guys? That's my thought. And he's like, he's asking to engage these guys. I'm like, we don't know. Hey, how many guys who's the most southern guy out here? And he calls me up and he goes, well, I'm the most southern JTAC. And I go, that's not what I asked you. I said, is there anybody south of your position? Because I know where you're at. And he goes, then his call back to me was ceasefire 3 times. Because he was hearing the comms. He's hearing what's going on. And things were, everyone's trying to do the job, but we're on the edge of losing control. And the hair on the back of my neck is standing up. And so he calls everybody on the net, ceasefire, ceasefire, ceasefire. I'm going to go find out who's south of me. And it seemed like 20 minutes, but it was probably about 40 seconds. And he comes back and he goes, his next call is ceasefire, ceasefire, ceasefire. I got 30 to 40 guys south of my pause. He goes, I don't know the distance. And then my last call was, everybody on the net, ceasefire, ceasefire, ceasefire. That was my last call that night because I broke my radio switch. I went Nordo. And it took me about 5 minutes to figure out what was going on there. But, God was on my wing because he gave me enough with that radio switch to get done what I needed to do. And to me, that was my best mission because I didn't drop anything. I didn't kill anybody. I didn't get any bad guys. But we kept the worst thing from happening, which was hurting any of our own guys. And I can't say that we were going to hurt somebody, but it didn't feel good. And so, if we had to train officers and write doctrine, in my mind, it's to be able to deal with the application of violence, which is a terrible thing. We're being told to do something bad for a good reason, but it's still bad, and it got potentially bad consequences. And as officers and as warfighters, and it's just the enlisted too, anybody who's on the back end of a gun, we got to manage this and make good decisions with limited information. And so you don't know what you don't know. So you try to figure out if I got a 95% solution, and then again, you can't let perfection be the enemy of good enough. Because if you think you got a 95% solution, and somebody's going to die if you don't do anything, it's time to do something. And that's my
good
wrap-up.
Decisions with limited information. That's brilliant. We're a little past time here. If you guys will give me just an extra couple minutes, I want to give the audience one more time for a question here. Did I have any more questions from the audience?
Chief Master Sergeant Humphrey, Matt Kunson, Wolfpack. So one takeaway that I had was from your operational environment, you guys had to learn mission command really quickly on the curve, right? And just due to the chaos of combat that was going on station. But then I also listened to the challenges that you faced and the frustrations that you faced with establishing the base and the FOB. And so as we move forward as the Air Force with great power competition, right? I listened to your story and I believe and have a great level of confidence in our officers and our pilots to have that ability to learn on the curve in the combat situation. But when we talk about ACE and in Indo-PACOM, establishing the base with the speed and operations of which we're going to need to do in multiple locations is extremely problematic. So if you were to have an opportunity to institute into the Barnes Center the most key thing about mission command principles and where to teach that on the logistical level, what would you do?
I'll speak, Chief, from that perspective. So as a wing commander, I had to pivot. We'll depart a little bit from Anaconda. My combat-coded squadron came home from OIR, and within 6 weeks, we were put on notice to get ready for Korea. Okay, 2017, 18, you remember the time. What I will tell you is my experience from what I saw as a captain, and I learned a lot, is, dumb knuckle-dragging fighter pilot. who knows nothing about maintainers and anything else that I had to learn over my career was delegation and empowerment. And that, like what I learned, Gunny, who is our head maintainer, chief, like watching him go to work and seeing him empowered by both surgeon and by El Cid and everybody else to like do what was right. Like, we're pilots. We don't know. You're going to put a Maverick on a couple sandbags? That doesn't sound safe, but, and okay, that's what makes sense right here, right? And I took that forward, and what I realized was when I looked at what we were going to go do and what I asked my folks to do and my maintainer, you know, even in OIR, I had a lieutenant colonel squadron commander who had 400 maintainers running 24/7 ops. And as you know, what did I have? I had a captain and a second lieutenant running maintenance 24 hours a day. That meant my maintenance is 12 hours a day as I got a second lieutenant who's running that show. Well, no, not really. I've got senior NCOs running that show, right? I mean, like, that's the reality of the situation. We all know it. And so what it is for me, it's teaching the officer corps of understanding your role and understanding your experts, right? And understanding who knows the right answers. Like, I learned this luckily I learned this as a young captain. My prized possession, truth in lending, is from maintainers, both as a captain all the way through wing commander. My best stuff in my house are from my maintenance guys and gals. But I learned that early on because on the operator side of the house, we don't realize that. We don't learn that at a young age because we're never given the responsibility. But, you know, as a wing commander, I had a 700-member EMS who was run by a major and a second lieutenant. And it took me a while to understand, like, what does that mean? And what that means is that the officers need to learn quickly that their NCO corps, what differentiates us from the Russians? It's a professionalized NCO corps. And so when I look at ACE, the core of ACE is what we were doing. We were doing it in Jacobabad. We did it at Bagram. So this isn't new. We act like it's new. We gave it a new acronym. Okay, so I'm going to get on my high horse here for a minute because I joke about this all the time, as many of us do, at like, oh, we've discovered fire again. I'm like, no, we haven't. We learned from Afghanistan because in OIF, we deployed A-10s to H-5 in Jordan, and we forward deployed them to H-1 in Iraq. Where did they learn that from? They learned it from what we learned, all good and bad. What was the core of it? Our NCOs. And so I think what this is really driving us to is a goodness, which is teaching our officer corps. What's a takeaway from what we've been talking about? El Cid said it: centralized command and centralized execution. You can't do that. It's got to be decentralized execution. The only way you do decentralized execution is for our officer corps. If we're going to do ACE properly, we're going to put a captain in charge. The only way a captain can do that is with a highly skilled NCO corps. And I think that my biggest learning point over 25 years was exactly that. I saw it as a young captain. I didn't really know what I was seeing. I knew like Gunny was like a god to me as a captain. This chief we had, like, who was making these decisions about what we're going to do with airplanes. I learned later as a squadron commander, but especially as a group and a wing commander, was that the only way you do this kind of stuff is a highly trained, highly empowered. That's the difference. There's a difference between saying I have a highly skilled NCO corps. The difference is a highly empowered NCO corps, where that, like, the chiefs know that the 06 absolutely has their back. And just like the same things we were talking about is like, go get the job done. When I tell my senior NCOs, you know, like when we went through this thrash and I brought in my seniors and chiefs, I'm like, get this done. I'm not smart enough to tell you how to do it, but I'm telling you, you know how to do it, and I will take any bullet from above for you to do it the way you think it's the way it's supposed to be done.
And that's what we need to teach our officers, in my humble opinion, is how do you do that as a senior leader?
I think there's also, though, a requirement, Chief. So I grew up in the old checkered flag days. So we used to, every 2 years, deploy to wherever we thought we were going to go fight the Russians. And when we did that, we built a tent city from scratch, wherever it was. But the other thing that we did that we don't often do now is all our enlisted personnel learned a new skill. So they took them out and taught the guy who's the admin personnel how to refuel aircraft. They taught people how to drive vehicles. And during those checkered flag things, people got checked out to do things that wasn't in their AFSC.
Yep.
And somehow I think we need to spend more time doing that. Because when I showed up at Bagram with 99 people, that's all the boots on the ground they let me have, I had 6 rifles for our maintainers because our maintainers didn't have rifles then. You know, and the Army goes, hey, you're part of the Air Base Defense. Where's your weapons? Well, I don't have them because they didn't deploy over with them because I deployed forward from a forward deployed location. So ground-based defense, all the other stuff, and I understand we used to use the term augmentee, security force augmentee, medical augmentee. I can't teach everyone to do everything, but I can teach specific people to do other things, and that was probably a detriment to us when we were at Bagram. When the Army kicked out 20 GP medium tents, none of our enlisted personnel had ever seen one. All they knew was temper tents. So I had been a survival instructor prior to becoming a pilot, and so I said, okay, I'm going to show you how to put 2 together because we had really smart maintainers. They'd just never seen a GP medium tent before. I showed them how to put 2 up, and they put the rest of them up themselves better than I probably would have done it. But that's part of the training that we probably need to do across the board, and I don't know the answer to that yet. But the multi-capable airman thing, you're not going to be able to do ACE if everyone stays in their little stovepipe of excellence.
What I'd like to do is just in 1 or 2 sentences kind of give your big takeaway from Anaconda and from your experience. We'll use that in closing. So I'll start here with Mumbles, just a closing thought.
Yeah, just to touch on that. Our surgeon and I were on our way back from Bagram to go to Al Jaber to launch the next group of A-10s back into Bagram. So we were on a 130 out of Bagram, heading through Kandahar. And on board was a whole bunch of Army guys. I'm not sure what organization they were. Do you remember?
They were 10th Mountain.
Okay.
Light Infantry.
And I remember the first sergeant got up, grabbed Arden and I as we were near the front of the aircraft, and they said, you guys flying the A-10s? He goes, yep. We go, yes, we were. He goes, I want to thank you. I says, until the night that you showed up, for more than 4 days, my troops didn't have a night's rest. But when the A-10 showed, we finally were able to give some of our guys some rest. So that was touching for us. So now we had a buddy of ours' son, and then to have the first sergeant say that was amazing. From my perspective, the events that happened there, the reason why they were successful was because of the leadership that we had from El Cid to surgeon, and then the unbelievable tactical expertise of the pilots, okay, and the unbelievable professionalism of our enlisted corps. Unbelievable. That's what made this thing. Everybody worked together. I don't remember a single problem. There may have been some, but I don't remember any. I just remember all the successes. So that was amazing.
So my final thoughts would be 3 wars. I got to Desert Storm as an attritfil. I got into the stadium on the night before the ground war, and once again, my bladder was not, I couldn't hold it. I got down from the jet after a 12-hour ferry mission from England down to King Fahd. Colonel Hank Hayden met me at the jet, and I was like, sir, with all due respect, I haven't taken a leak in 12 hours. I walked over the vet wall, spent about 10 minutes taking care of business. I'm wiping my hands on my G-suit. When I come back to him, Lieutenant Kostelnik reports his order, and I'm ready, unemployed, looking for work. And his exact words were to me was, son, he goes, you're a day late and $1 short, get on the next airlifter and go home. That's what I would do if I was you, because you're the last guy in, you'd be the last guy out. And I said, sir, you know I'm not doing that. And he goes, well, that's what I would expect from you. So I served as a frago for a couple nights. It was about 5 nights. And then I did get on an airlifter when my bosses from home told me to come home. So then we go to the Balkans. Once again, I was on staff in the Balkans, and we had the air war over Serbia. And, here I am as an attack pilot. I'm supposed to be fighting in a war, and I'm on staff doing paperwork and pushing ATOs to the guys that are out there. It's easy to sit there and get to demotivate yourself, but you fight the war that you got, the way that you account yourself for what you're asked to do as best as you can, and you make yourself available to do whatever else they need, and that's the way it is. And my role there was probably a lot more significant than I would make it out to be, but I wasn't doing what I wanted to do, but I did what I was asked to do as best I could. Now you roll forward to, I'm a strap-hanging lieutenant colonel. I'm not part of the 74th, except for Colonel Dahl's invitation to tag along as a guy from the OSS, and I did, and the squadron made me feel like a part of it. I was supposed to be Sandy 1 on the day of 4 March. I was on the ATO to go take a mission up into the Super Mez and go up there and do what that job was. Soup showed up on the night of the 3rd and goes, hey, we're going to the show tomorrow. And I go, I got a mission. And he goes, no, we're going to the show. And I'm like, you mean like over to Afghanistan? And he goes, yeah, you and me. And I said, who's in lead? And he goes, because he's the weapons officer and he's the best pot in the squadron right now. And, I'm a old weapons officer, but I'm coming off staff, not very good anymore. And I'm like, he goes, I'm going to be leading it. And I go, you got the best number 2 you'll ever have. And that was what I was being asked to do. And so I just got put my cap on and said, dude, you're going to go out and support Soup as best you can, and we're going to get this job done. It would later serve me because a couple weeks later, when we got back from the show at Jalalabad, and then we're going to schism the squadron again, and we're going to send a crew up to Bagram, and we're going to keep a few people back to continue to do the CSAR mission. We had some young officers who were very upset. They had not gone to Jalalabad, and they were not going to Bagram. But there was reasons, because they were the right people to do what the job was at Jabber in support OSW. And so I had an opportunity to roll in and go, listen, you fight the war that you get served up as best you can, and you count yourself as well as you can when the time comes, and that's all anybody can ask of you. But that's what you got to ask. That's what you got to allow to happen, and be a part of the team. So I was able to counsel a couple of young officers to not to stay in the fight. Your time will come, but it's not right now. And I was going south to the kayak anyway. So the surgeon said you had your 5 minutes in the sun, and you're going down to the kayak. So that's my takeaway.
Here's what I would say. First off, trust your people. Give them a job to do. Check up on them. I had a lot of short meetings. I'd get everyone together and I go, okay, I need to know what you need. I'm going downtown to REI in Kuwait City to buy stuff this afternoon. And so I need to know what you need in 2 hours. Go back and figure out what you need. And I filled a Cadillac bin full of clothespins, shower curtains, all these things that came from people's ideas. There were no bad ideas, but you have to trust your people, because there's no way any one of us can sit down and come up with everything you need, because between the time that we landed back at Al Jaber until the time that we took off to go to Bagram, we had to completely refit. I had 2.5 days. And so short meetings, trust your people. Surgeon goes, well, you're the senior A-10 pilot in theater. Are you leading something like this? And I go, dude, I was an F-16 squadron commander, and I had 4 combat tours. So I said, no, you're the squadron commander. The hard part here is the logistics, the setup, the radios, all that stuff. I will try to do that because I know all the people on the other end of the phone in the UC, even though I wasn't very nice to some of them, some of the times. Trust your people and don't waste their time with a bunch of meetings, because they got stuff to do too. Tell them what you need, trust them to do it, and have them get back with you. All of these fine airmen, airwomen, but in any case, they performed phenomenally, and every single one of these people here, a hero. So
I think one of the biggest takeaways that I learned throughout the whole thing, and Elsa just touched about it, is the importance of logistics and how much you don't realize, especially when you're on the pointy end of something and you're trying to run fast, how important logistics is when you're getting to a place. Jacobabad, like we talked about, had some of that and was fairly set up. When we got to Bagram and we didn't have that, and we're fighting to get it, and things are coming in. We don't have food, we don't have water, we don't have things like that we're trying to get. He mentioned, okay, we need clothespins, we need trash cans, things that we were thinking about before we left, but then all the things we hadn't thought about, and then all just the daily things we needed to just execute and live. We didn't have those, and we were relying on someone to bring those in, hence why he was yelling at everyone and I was laughing. But those kinds of things that you may not think about, in terms of being the pilot, being the operator, when you're just trying to get in there and go as fast as you can, then you get there and you're like, oh, I guess I need that. Does anybody have toilet paper? Oh, I have a baby wipe. Those kinds of things, we don't have running water. How are we going to do that? So there's a lot of challenges that, again, thinking about now the importance of logistics and now learning that throughout that kind of thing. So, and then again, the trust and the teamwork. Everybody had to pitch in, and it didn't matter who you were, what you were trained to do. It was now your job. Everything was your job. And sometimes it was about slowing down. When we talked about the chaos out there, you had to slow down to go fast. If somebody was screaming and you had to figure out who it was, fast wasn't always the right answer. Slow was a lot of times the right answer. And I think finally K9 touched upon it when he was talking about muck and what our job was. When you get older, like the rest of these people are up here, people will ask you questions about what you did and about your stories and things like that. And they ask you, well, what happened? How many bad guys were out there? What was your impact? Things like that. People who died, who was killed, where, and everything else. I always tell them that's not what it's about. It's about who lived. It's about who is sitting down at dinner tonight with their families, just like we do every night because we were there. And that's what I always tell my kids and everybody else, is that's what our job was and is, and what everybody else's job here is, to make sure everybody comes home and that everybody is safe. It's that we all sit down with our families when it's all said and done together.
Difficult to pile on. A lot of great things have been said, which were on my list. Answer your age question, there was a point in all this that we had a third of the squadron at Bagram, a third of the squadron at Al Jaber, and a third of the squadron at home at Pope. In every place, there was a first sergeant, there was a senior NCO running maintenance, there was an acting squadron commander, an acting DO, and so that doesn't happen overnight. Leadership training and units day by day, you're always trying to replace yourself, and that's hard work. And then, as we said to you, you load and shoot and forget. I had no wherewithal to track what was going on back at Al Jaber when I was forward, or what was going on at Bagram when I was back at Al Jaber, which was the home. So a lot of trust in the people that if you've signed mission type orders, here's your task. And if they're senior NCOs, because I had senior airmen taking senior NCO or NCO type of functions and responsibilities. I had captains taking on DO responsibilities. If they've had good models and good mentorship, and it's been done as a culture over the years, you're now in a position to be able to go split to the winds and do ACE. We're not going to do ACE very well unless you go practice it and expose all the youngsters how to be problem solvers and take on more than one role, which you brought up earlier. I looked at the awards that we gave our maintenance guys. Had like 120 Air Force Combination Medals and Air Force Achievement Medals for all these kids, most of them senior airmen. some staff sergeants, the majority of them, taking on roles and responsibilities that they were not yet at the 5 level for, much less, have the stripes for it. And I just marveled over it because we had the superior NCO Corps and a lot of outstanding performers. There were like a half dozen Bronze Stars out of the NCOs from this trip in 3 months. And we would not have succeeded, even begun to even try the fact that the maintenance logistics piece figured out how to get it done. And they were innovative, and they dealt with the uncertainty, and they figured out how to go find and make it work. And they were also cheering, sitting on top of light halls when jets came back clean.
Yep.
The bombs are gone. In a mud heap, lived in tents on the side of the, in Jacobad, they lived in tents on the side of the Army area in the mud. About 30 of them were there, and they were, "What can we do now, sir?" So how you train against the next one? We kept talking about uncertainty. There's no magic cure or formula for how to persevere through uncertainty unless you just do it. So in a training environment, you got to have an op for. You cannot control your own scenarios. You start there in the basics, whether it's on the maintenance side or it's on the ops side. Eventually, you have to let go of some of those variables and let somebody else control them, make you work and make adjustments. Some cultures are really good at that. Others are more black line, piecemeal, straight line. We saw that in Kosovo, where we saw units fail because they had everything perfect where they would go, and they never went. And other units went in there and figured it out, even though it was messy. Once you're in it, the best antidote for the uncertainty, friction, dealing with the fog, dealing with just the garbage is real lean on people who've been there before. The experience, I think you're bringing up K9, haven't been there before, don't know what it's like, so you can coach guys. When we went into Desert Storm, we had a couple of 06s who'd been to Vietnam and had been shot before. The rest of the rank and file, Lieutenant Colonel on down, never seen it. There were 158 10s there at the time. There were like 300 pilots. And we had like 5 or 6 people who had actually been shot before. And they sat down the night before the war started and said, "This is what it's like. You're not going to know what's going to be going on. Even if you're winning, you won't know what's going on. You won't see everything. You won't control everything. So all the things you did in training where you thought you trained up to the perfect mission, now you're going to have to live and persevere through the garbage. Get used to it." And some people handle it better than others, but the best lubrication on the battlefield is experience. And if you don't have combat experience in the ranks, then you actually then have to go find some good op fours and pull the rug out from under people on wherever they work. You don't have what you usually think you have. You don't have the comms connection to the SATCOM. You don't have F-35 Alice to load your mission data in and to figure out what parts you were. So how are you going to do it? You have to train that way. And finally, we really hit on mission type orders. Once there's confidence in leadership, the boss has given me a job to do. It's a little more than I usually will get, but he trusts me to do it. He told me this is what we're trying to aim at. He has my back. If I screw it up a little bit, I'm trying hard to do it right. People will blossom when they know that the leadership knows they're going to make mistakes, knows they're going to have oopses, but they're working to correct them. And also, you give them limits of this is where your range of limit of decision authority is. If it gets to this point, you have to think about this as up the chain. Here's where you come ask the question versus the micromanagement, and not trusting them in every little decision. So confidence in the ranks knows you have their back. Confidence in the leadership knowing that you give them the type of mission type orders that they're going to do the best they can and they're going to come for help. And it's hard work and you got to persevere. And you do have to weed out some folks. Probably speaking to the choir here now. You're singing all on key. You have to weed out the folks that either are unable or you can't trust. Hair warm, not on fire. Friendlies will make errors. Expect them. When you run into the thing you didn't expect, then you apply your best known solution that's worked in the past until it doesn't work, and start making adjustments. You have to be able to know the difference. I was thinking, my dad flew F-4s escorting gunships in Vietnam from the perch. Before I went into Desert Storm as a young captain, my dad, who had 113 night sorties and F4s over Laos, North Vietnam, he told me of things to watch out for. So even though they're not around anymore, the older generations can tell you what, like Clausewitz can. It's simple, but it's hard. And that's my takeaway.
Know your role. So, as a CAS guy who's been an 82nd dude, command and general staff guy, I've spent a fair time around the Army. I was a master air attack planner for Task Force 20 and OIF with the Rangers and Tier 1 guys. Know your role. As a service, I'll be critical here. We like to wear our service on our shoulder. As an aide to General Goldfein back in the day, he asked me as he was addressing the weapons school graduating class, what do I say to them? It's not a patch wear. I said, don't wear your MDS on your shoulder, your weapon system. Okay, you're a weapons officer, an Air Force weapons officer. I'll take that to a step above. Don't be an airman. I got it. That's probably contrary to a lot of things we hear. You're a joint warfighter. So in the case, so I pointed it out to Donk. So Donk's little thing on the bottom of his email may have changed over time, but as I recall, it said, find a way to yes, because an 18-year-old rifleman depends on it. Their life may depend on it. That was our role. All the parochialisms between big Air Force and big Army ain't my problem as a guy who's sitting over the battlefield. My job is to get those soldiers home alive. I don't care about the doctrine. I don't care about we didn't coordinate, our stuff's in the street, their stuff's in the... None of that matters anymore. At the point of attack, what's your job? What's your role? Close air support ends in support. We're supporting. This is a big thing for those of you who are Army in general, which I've learned spending enough time around them. Supporting and supporting is everything. Know your role. And we, as CAS pilots, were always supporting. They on the ground were supported. None of the other stuff, that's all noise. So in the situation, set that aside. When you step into those moments when we as a group are going to war, none of that matters anymore. Let the senior officers deal with that nonsense. Because my experience, both being there and then as a senior leader, is our captains and our NCOs are who solve all the world's problems. The senior officers just create them, frankly. And as somebody who became part of the problem at one point in my career. But the realization is that that's what we do, is we set it aside. So I'll end with an anecdote that we talked about, that we wouldn't leave this aside. So it was kind of touched on, but about 2 weeks after this was all over, we're at Bagram, and we stand up ops, and I get a phone call from my deputy ops group commander, a man named Muck Brown. So Lieutenant Colonel Brown calls me, and I get pulled over, like, hey, you need to take this phone call. Colonel Brown wants to talk to you. And I'm like, am I in trouble again? And he relays to me, goes, hey, I just want you to know that I talked to my son. His son was an 11 Bravo. For those of you who are not Army savvy, that's an infantryman. He's like, my son is a 10th Mountain soldier. And that first night you and K9 went in there, you saved his life. That's my why. Every day. And I get the privilege still to spend time with our Air Force Academy cadets. And they go, what do I want to do? And I go, you need to find your why. I always knew my why. That was my why. And in the end, that's the most important thing.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our guests for their time and their service. Thank you for joining us for this first LEDx. You all have a wonderful night. Safe drives home.
That's going to do it for this week's podcast. The show is recorded, edited, and produced by the LeMay Center's Doctrine Outreach section. Special thanks to our guests, the LeMay Center, and Air University. As always, the views expressed by our panel members are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of Air University, the Air Force, or any government agency. Thank you, and we will see you next time.